Linguistics is one of those branches of anthropology that some people tend to overlook. Me, on the other hand, I have always found linguistics really fascinating, how languages work together and where they come from and how they migrate from one part of the world to another. Sometimes that migration can take a short span of time or a much longer time. Sometimes you might be surprised at just where one branch or one language within a linguistic group happens to be as opposed to another. There are languages like Chamorro, which is related to languages in Indonesia, but it's way out in the Pacific, kind of away from a lot of other languages in that group. But what's even one of the even bigger surprises when you know your linguistics is the language of Malagasy, which is spoken on the island of Madagascar. The language is really a fascinating language because there's no actual examples of this language group between Indonesia and Malaysia. There's and between Indonesia and Malaysia and the island of Madagascar. And so one might think, well, does that mean that they went straight from those islands to Madagascar? Not likely. That's not how migration generally tends to work. They probably kind of moved along several Asian coasts, from through around India and through the Middle East and then down the African coast until they get to where they are now. And the one on Madagascar just happens to be the only one that kind of stuck when it was on that migratory process. And this is partly also because the Malagasy language, the people who lived on the island of Madagascar, it was not really much inhabited until well into the Common Era or the years or centuries after Christ, depending on how you measure time. And so the Malagasy language is just so fascinating, and comparing it with the other languages like Bahasa and Javanese, Sundanese, and Tagalog, and everything else. The little differences that are there, the different aspects of language that it picks up from other languages around it, are readily apparent if you know what to look for. And so if you're ever interested in learning a language that seems to be way out of the scope of where it's supposed to be, I definitely consider Malagasy worthy of your attention. What I want to emphasize right now, though, is another language or language group, I guess to be exact, that many people don't look into or investigate a lot. And by language group, this is mostly a geographical group, as the linguistic aspect of it itself has actually a much broader scope, and several of these languages aren't even related to each other. And these languages are among the Pueblo Indians, Native Americans, that we call the Pueblos. Back in the day, this group was designated as the Anasazi, but that is considered a derogatory word that was derived from the Navajo language. And so the members of the Pueblo people just do not like that word, do not call them Anasazi, even if you do pull up some old books that call them that. I have to admit that when I heard the term Anasazi, I thought it sounded kind of cool, but it is not a pleasant thing to be designated from the Navajo perspective. And so the Pueblos like to call themselves Pueblos. So with the Pueblo people, they live around the areas of what we call the Four Corners of the states of Utah, Arizona, Colorado, and New Mexico. And then, of course, there's some that kind of spread out a little bit down in southern New Mexico and Arizona. And there's some that are kind of close to the Mexican border, but we don't see a lot of those. There aren't as many people within this group that go that far south. Linguistically, that's slightly different because one of the languages is actually a member of the Uto-Aztecan family, but I might discuss that a little bit later. So there are 6 languages that people might call Pueblo languages. And so, as I said, there's a Uto-Aztecan language, and that language is called Hopi. I don't know if you've heard of the Hopi Indians, but they are down there. Actually, they are neighbors of the Navajo, but the Navajo aren't considered exactly part of that group. And the Hopi, of course, their language is related to the Aztecs, and depending on who you ask, some believe that the members of the Uto-Aztecan family migrated from the north down into the south, into what we know today as, the southwest of the United States, parts of Mexico, and of course around Mexico City. The Aztec language itself, as you could probably guess, is a member of that family. The native speakers of it call it Nahuatl. I hope I pronounced that correctly. The many times I've heard it pronounced, I seem to be told that I keep pronouncing it incorrectly since there's an L at the end of that word. But the Hopis have lived there for quite a while. And then there is another language group called the Tewa group. This actually makes up 3 different languages, though they are closely related. They are considered separate languages. And that is the Tewa, Tiwa, and Towa languages. And these languages were not exactly committed to writing until very recently, when the concept of writing made itself known in these areas down in the Four Corners and further south. They sort of discouraged the idea of writing their language out because it was considered something somewhat sacred, and they didn't want to pollute it with something foreign like that. It's something that they should keep in memory so that there's no outside corruption. And there are other examples of people doing this sort of thing in history. Of course, what that resulted in is a lot of languages dying out, and we don't know much about them except sometimes what their linguistic affiliation was. And that is sort of sad, of course, because I love languages, and it's just kind of culturally devastating to have lost a language like that. In my own opinion, I think that when a language dies, that a part of a culture, if not the culture itself, dies with it. So that's why, of course, I'm proponents of keeping the Irish Gaelic language, the Scottish Gaelic language, and the languages like Manx, Cornish, and other things like Basque, keeping them around because they are not only fascinating with where they come from and how they're used, but just the way they sound when they're put to music. A lot of times that just sounds really awesome. But going back to the Pueblo languages, so those Tewa, Tiwa, Towa, they're all related, and the people don't live too far apart from each other, but there are always little distinctive differences between what those people do and how they use their language. The languages use a lot of little phraseologies that don't always exactly translate word for word, just like any language does. But for those who are actually trying to learn the language, you might be a little surprised with some of the word variations or sentence constructions that show up there. Then the 5th language is called Keres. Now, some people consider Keres to be more than one language, just like the Tewa, Towa, Tiwa languages, but they are in such a way and they live so close together that they're just considered dialects of the same language. So the distinct difference between language and dialect is a lot of times skewed, but in this case, I think I will consider them as dialects of the same language because with the way things are, I mean, that could be just similar to like the English you speak in Boston and the English you speak in Los Angeles, or the English you speak in, let's say, Nebraska or in Arizona compared with the English that is spoken in Australia. They're all considered English. Therefore, we're just kind of working around that aspect of language. And since these languages are so close together and mutually intelligible, they're not really different languages. The Scots language is a little different because the differences and variations there, as I've already discussed about the Scots language, are pretty much different enough from each other. I mean, they're as different from each other as, say, Danish and Norwegian. And so I do consider those a different language, especially since they do have a separate writing tradition that has come down to us. There are quite a few things that have come out of after we came out of the Middle Ages and the Anglo-Saxon languages sort of started dividing between northern and southern variations. What happens with Scots, of course, they have their own writing traditions, and then the southern English have theirs. And just like a lot of other languages that kind of sprout away from each other, like Afrikaans and Dutch, you could argue, well, they're mutually intelligible, yet they are different enough that they're considered different languages, as with the Gaelic languages as well. Now, the last language that I'm going to talk about really quickly is the Zuni language. So I'm not sure if that's exactly the way they pronounce that word, but I'll just assume it is. I have never heard this language pronounced. I do want to try and pull up perhaps some examples off of YouTube sometime and sit and listen and see if anyone is actually there willing to teach the Zuni language. I don't think I'm going to do a full in-depth study to learn to speak it and read it and write it, but I think it is worth listening to see what they do with it. The Zuni language is considered one of the oldest languages on the planet. It's pretty much stayed largely in the area that it's in right now for thousands of years, and it's evolved only a little bit over time. And the Zuni people, of course, they really hold tight to their language. They hold it dear to keep it going because as Europeans started encroaching on their territory, the Zuni people fought to keep their traditions and to keep everything as close to the way they were before as time progressed. And of course, one of the best ways to do that is to preserve their language. And it's interesting what this language has gone through and how it has survived despite all the pressures around it. The Zunis are considered part of the Pueblo people. They are considered culturally a part of the same group in this particular part of America as all of the other Pueblos, but their culture is distinct, and like the Tewa, Tiwa, and Toa people, they are kind of averse to writing it down. I think they are even more averse to writing it down than are the Tewa, Toa, and Tiwa. Therefore, most of the time, you'll see maybe a couple people writing down some glossary type words, trying to give you as close to an approximation of the letters from the Roman alphabet with this language as possible. But there is no official written form of this language because of what I told you about them not liking to write it down. And especially with them, the preservation of the language is mandatory for the preservation of the culture and to preserve pretty much most of its cultural heritage, because if the language did die out, there's probably a whole lot of things that would be forgotten, and that of course is a really terrible thing to see cultural aspects forgotten about traditions, whether traditions of making things or music or traditions of activities that are involved as part of ritual that are part of that culture. And I will look into those things a little bit more as time progresses. I don't know if I'm going to talk about it on one of my podcasts or not, because there are just so many things that I like to look into. And part of the reason why I got into studying this, of course, I really went into studying it because of an anthropology class I took in order to get through my master's program at Utah State. So while I was working with my folklore classes, I decided to take this class as sort of an addendum to it. I don't know if you realize this, but a lot of folklorists are actually anthropologists, or they start out that way, and then they go in the folklore direction. And linguistics is an aspect of anthropology. It's just that generally is not considered part of folklore per se. It's just a medium through which folklore is transmitted. So a couple years ago, I actually visited what is known as that Four Corners region, and that's where for the first time, I had met several people who were part of that linguistic family and cultural family. Something I noticed that is really sad is that some languages down there are really on the brink of dying out. Another language that is spoken down there that is not actually considered part of the Pueblos is the Ute language, which the state of Utah is named after. And that Ute language is related actually to Hopi and the Aztec languages. And that language is dying out. I spoke to someone who said, well, I did know it and I spoke it as I was growing up, but, I didn't really have much use for it and I didn't teach it to my kids. And so, progressively that language has a good chance of dying out. And I'm hoping that doesn't happen with these Pueblo languages or other North American, South American native languages, so that, more cultural understandings and communications and ways people understand things can stay together and remain a part of everyday life for those people. I just realized that with these 6 languages, I'm amazed at how closely these people have actually remained together, despite the fact that many of them, their languages really have nothing to do with each other. They've just kind of geographically been in that location. And archaeologically, a lot of the ways that they have done things that have been investigated are really quite similar, despite what was clearly a very diverse and different kind of past that they lived in and they worked with. So that's what I've got to say about the linguistics here of the Four Corners region and, of course, the Southwest. There are too many languages in the Southwest to really talk about all of them. But since I took this class that talked about the Pueblos, I felt that I would want to actually talk about it and give you a good intro into how language works with culture and how different things can work together despite how different they may appear on the surface. And that's what I've got to say, and I'll talk to you again next time.